Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the 2021 Religious Freedom Index. We're going to give just a moment more for people to start, and then we will begin. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and start. We've given just about a minute more for others to join. I'm Caleb Lyman. I'm Beckett's Director of Research, and I'm very excited to share the results of the 2021 Religious Freedom Index with you all today and in the coming days. I'd invite everybody to visit becketlaw.org/index to view the full report and the many additional materials and resources that allow you to explore the index results far beyond what we'll be able to share today. We're also very happy to make the full data set available to anyone interested. And as in years past, the data set will be available both through our website and through the Association of Religion Data Archives, the ARDA, and it'll be posted there in the coming weeks. Today, we'll have a presentation, a panel discussion, and we'll also have some time for question and answer at the end. So please submit any questions that you have to media@becketlaw.org, and we will be able to field as many of those as we can at the end, both with the presenters and the panelists. So with this third edition of the index, our study is now a trilogy. And like any good trilogy, we've already seen some ups and downs, in this case, and fluctuations of slight changes in support for different areas of religious freedom. We've gone to some exciting new locations with questions on topics that I never would have predicted that we would have been asking in the first installment. I'm definitely thinking COVID questions fall into that category. And we've had many surprises along the way in the form of unexpected results and many surprising areas of support from different subgroups. But also, unlike any good trilogy, our main characters here are completely static. The 21 questions that make up the index are still asked with the exact same language and in the exact same order every year. It's only the results that are changing. But I like to think of this year's index in terms of a trilogy as kind of the Return of the Jedi for the Star Wars fans out there, for reasons that you'll see, I think, when we get into sharing the results. And Star Wars is hopefully a good analog for other reasons as well for our original trilogy. We hope that everyone will appreciate the original trilogy, but of course, we never really expect to end at 3. The results of finally starting to see the trends emerge with 3 years of data, and as this data set grows, are just, I think, too exciting for us to stop. So we hope to have at least as many versions of the index in the future as there are sequels and spin-offs of Star Wars. So without going too far into this Star Wars analogy, as can happen too often, let's get to those results and start sharing what we see this year in the index results. And again, I just want to remind you throughout our panel presentation and the results presentation, if you have any questions, please send them to media@becketlaw.org, where we'll be able to field those at the end or otherwise respond to you. So to get us started, I'd like to hand it over to Dee Alsop, who is the CEO and managing partner at Heart and Mind Strategies, our longtime partner in the index. And he will introduce us to the index and start to show us some of this year's Return of the Jedi results. So Dee, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Caleb, and good afternoon, everyone. This project is near and dear to our hearts and one we're very privileged to continue to be involved with. My objective is to talk to you a little bit about the approach to it. And go ahead, Caleb, move ahead. One of the keys to any good index is consistency in the methodology over time. Everything in the world might change, but the way we're measuring it is consistent as we can possibly be. In addition to these 3 waves that we've done, just so you know, we did some beta testing in 2017 and 18 to kind of develop this index. And we've been doing it now officially for 3 years, each year running it at about the same time in the year, late September, October, early October. And then we're doing with the same audience, same sample size. And as Caleb mentioned, the same exact questions in the same exact order for those that are involved in the index. If you go to the next slide, the other thing that's important for a good index is to make sure it's very high level of analytic and robustness, as well as subject matter integrity. In other words, the concepts that we're measuring tied closely to the way people look at and think about these issues. So Going back before the index was launched, we actually explored dozens and dozens of possibilities, ideas, or what we call variables to be included in the index. Putting them all out there, we began to conduct a variety of different types of analyses to sort out those that really don't make a lot of difference or distinguish between different types of groups and their attitudes, and eliminated those. We arrived at these 21 variables that now make up the index, and did a type of analysis that created different types of categories of questions that conveys important components of religious freedom and tolerance. So I'll talk about those in just a minute. But we ended up with 6 of those dimensions that are meaningful constructs. And those are then kind of converted to a scale. So even though they're measured slightly different, they're on the same way that we, 0 to 100 scale, that we can easily compare between them. And then the other thing is we repeat these exactly the same way each year over time. So let's go to the index. And just to help orient you a little bit here, that one line that's going up and down just kind of shows you it goes from 0, which is completely opposed to religious freedom, to 100 at the top, which is completely supportive of religious freedom in all aspects. And the first thing that you notice is that all of the different components of the index are in a positive territory. The one that's in the highest positive territory are are those things that have to do with religious pluralism. And those are things like everyone should have a right to choose a religion, or everyone should have the opportunity to pray or worship without persecution. And then it goes on to other things like religious sharing, where it's still very, very positive, but not quite as strong, that have to do with things like people should be able to share or preach their feelings about faith and their beliefs and doctrines. All the way to things like church and state, which is the lowest one on the second from the right. It's still in positive territory, but this gets into more of the specific types of things like religious organizations that provide services to help in the community should be just as eligible to receive government funds as non-religious organizations. Things in which there's not quite the high degree of similarity of support, that there's a lot of differences in views on those things. So those are the 6 concepts. Religion policy is another one, religion and society, and religion and action is another one. And Caleb will get into some of the details on those. But the other thing to notice here now, if you go to the next slide, is just the trend of what's happening year over year. From last year, everything ticked upwards on every one of these 6 dimensions. And the consistency of the positive direction is meaningful, but also you have a couple of them like religious pluralism and religious share, religion and society, where you had a 3-point movement from last year. When you're at 3 points, that goes kind of outside of the statistical probability, means there's something real that's going on here. It's just not random chance, statistical random chance. There's something real going on here. So there is really a return of something, and it's really a return from, if you go to the next slide, we really kind of moved from where we were 2 years ago. On some of these, we dropped back down, and now we're back to the same place. And there's a little bit further upward trend than that on a couple dimensions, but we really did kind of bounce back from where we were 2 years ago before COVID. So that's just a general lay of the land, a little bit about how the index was built and how we measure it. Let's go now to what it all says and what we're learning about it this year.
Thank you, Dee. And I think we are all very excited to see the results from the index this year. It's an amazing tool that we've built to be able to not only track changes over time in a number of questions, but really to look at a holistic view of religious liberty with the breadth of questions that we have. And that's really what the index provides us with, those 2 things: a full spectrum view of religious liberty issues and the ability to track changes and trends in those issues over time. So this year, with everything that Dee just explained, what we really feel like we're seeing is that Americans are bouncing back from really what was an especially divisive year, with newfound confidence in their support for a wide spectrum of religious freedom principles. So as Dee showed, that we have a new high index score and many changes. When it comes to what that means and how that connects to what we're saying, both a rebound in support and newfound confidence. When it comes to that rebound in support, we see 3 dimensions reached new highs. The other 3 matched their previous highs. And at the individual question level, 15 of 21 questions, so more than 2/3 of those questions reached new high levels of support or positive views of religious liberty. So definitely a rebound overall in that really wide breadth of religious liberty issue support. And then when we talk about newfound confidence or a new confidence or a move back to confidence, what are we talking about? I think two things that kind of show this are, one, in an area where we ask 16 questions that are very structurally similar. They ask about acceptance and support versus challenging and opposing, a number of religious freedom examples, basically. And on 15 of 16 of those items, not only did more respondents say that they accept and support these items, but more said they completely accept and support, which is the highest intensity response option available than any other option. So not just more acceptance and support in general or in net, but more complete acceptance and support than even those that said that they mostly accept and support. And that seems to indicate confidence to us. And also there were many increases in the areas where people said they completely accept and support those individual items. There was a 4% average increase in that highest intensity option of those 16 items. So that's kind of what we're seeing from a very broad sense. And there are three key findings that we see where we see that broad principle finding playing out. First, that Americans want a fair shake for faith-based organizations. When people of faith and when people of religious motivations are pushed by their religion and by their beliefs to go out and do something good in the community, what does that mean for religious liberty? What does that mean for these faith-based organizations and how they interact both with others in the community and with government? Secondly, Americans value religious voices in a national conversation. There are many very intense debates going on in our country right now. And where do religious voices fit in those debates? And how does religious speech fit with the context, broader context of free speech? And third, in the pandemic, how are opinions still evolving and where have opinions crystallized? We see that Americans agree on the essentials and prioritize houses of worship in a pandemic. So these are what we're finding to be three specific findings that kind of fit under that broader umbrella of both a rebound in support and a newfound confidence. So to jump into some of these individual areas, when it comes to faith-based organizations, we ask each year in a question in the index that is part of the church and state dimension, whether or not religious organizations should be as eligible as non-religious organizations to receive government funds or not. And this is usually an area that we see high levels of support, 66, 65% in 2019 and 2020. But this past year, we saw the most significant increase in support among any individual index question. So a 6-point rise to 71% of respondents who said that religious organizations should be just as eligible as non-religious organizations to receive government funds. And there's not only that overall increase, but again, if you look at that chart on the right, you see a 5-point increase in that group that chose the highest intensity response option. In this case, those that said their opinion was exactly reflected by this statement. And so not just in the funding context, but in a more broad context of government partnerships, where religious organizations and government are often trying to do very similar things in the community and find it advantageous to partner with each other. Now, we've seen many conflicts recently in the religious liberty sphere where the government is picking and choosing religious beliefs that they will or will not partner with. And so we asked respondents what do they think of the situation and how should government go about partnering with faith-based organizations. 65% of the total sample said that government should partner with faith-based organizations based on their proven track record of success, even if their beliefs may at sometimes be at odds with government or mainstream beliefs. And it was very interesting to see some of the subgroups where this was also consistent. So majorities of Democrat, Independent, and Republican respondents chose the same position. The government should partner with faith-based organizations that have a proven track record of success. Not only was this consistent across many partisan lines, but also those that said faith was personally important to them and those that said faith was not personally important to them sided with this position. So this, I think, also connects very directly to recent Supreme Court cases, such as the Fulton v. Philadelphia case, where the government chose not to partner with or to end a 200-year partnership with a Catholic foster care agency in Philadelphia. And we asked also about what respondents think of that decision of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, you cannot choose not to partner with this Catholic foster agency because of its religious beliefs. And a slight majority of respondents agreed with that decision of the Supreme Court. Another area where there's an upcoming Supreme Court case dealing with this role of faith-based organizations or people doing things because of their religious motivations is in the Carson v. Macon case that deals with private religious schools. And so we asked a question kind of laying out what the options are for the Supreme Court to look at in this case as well. And we asked, when the government makes funds available to private schools in general, whether that's through a tuition program or a voucher or something else, should private religious schools have equal access to those funding opportunities? And should they have access only if they're religious in name, or if yes, they also do religious activities? And a majority said that the government should, or that these private religious schools should have equal access to those government funding programs that are in place, whether they engage in religious activities or not. And only a fifth of respondents said that private religious schools should be excluded in these situations. So we see not only an increase in support for faith-based organizations and their ability to express their religious freedom through doing good in the community, but we also see high levels of support for some very specific contexts. So this causes us to question what's kind of behind this. And one area that we're looking to and that we're interested in is that there was an increased appreciation for the contributions of religion and people of faith to society. So this year, 54% of respondents said that they appreciate these contributions either completely or a good amount. And this was, again, another area where we see an increase in that highest intensity response option, an 8-point bump from last year of those that are saying they completely accept and appreciate these contributions. And that, I think, also takes us to then our second key finding, where we're looking at free speech and religious speech and the way that these interactions take place in the very heated public debate that is going on today. We asked respondents, what's the place of religious-based opinions in these public debates? And 62% of the total sample of all of our respondents said that people with religiously based views should be free to share them in public. And again, that was an area where there were majorities of both the respondents that said their faith was important and said their faith was not important, that agreed with this position, that there is a place for these religious-based opinions and ideas. Another part of what we do in the index survey is ask about people's definitions of religious liberty. And this year, 83% said that the ability to express or share beliefs is an absolutely or very important part of what makes up religious liberty. And so we also started to look into some individual contexts, and there's definitely greater variation in when you get into these individual contexts of where people apply those principles of allowing people with religious-based opinions to share their opinions and share their ideas or not. One area where we see this playing out a lot recently is in public education sphere. So we asked respondents, who are the primary educators of their children in the context of curriculum? Should parents with moral objections be able to opt their children out? And 63%, so nearly 2/3 of respondents said that parents are the primary educators of their children, that they should have the final say in curriculum and be able to opt their children out of public school curriculum or teachings that they think are morally objectionable. When we looked at the individual partisan differences, a majority, again, of Democrat, Independent, and Republican respondents said that parents should have the final say and be able to opt their children out. There was certainly a spread there between the Democrat and Republican sides, but still majorities of each. This might be an area where, a unique area of the index where maybe those who have children in the home or those that don't have children in the home might be different, but it actually was not. 2/3 of those that said they have children in the home agreed with this position, that parents should have the final say in what their children are taught in public schools. But so too did 61% of those that did not have children in the home. Another area where this takes place is not just in public school curriculum, but in the close sibling of free speech of religious assembly. And religious assembly on campuses at public universities is an area where we've seen many conflicts recently. And so we asked, is there a place, first of all, for religious student groups on public university campuses? And then secondly, when those groups do meet on public university campuses, should they be able to choose leaders who follow their faith, who match the teachings of their faith? And nearly 2/3 of respondents, 63%, said that religious student groups should have a place on campus just like all others. And almost the same portion of respondents said that these religious student groups should be able to ask their leaders to follow their faith. And the question that we don't have a lot of time to get into right now, but I think is very interesting. I would encourage you all to look at the full report where we get more into this question, was a question about free speech and professors. And we asked, whether we split the sample and asked whether professors should be able to share religiously based views on controversial topics to one half of the sample, and the other half of the sample received the same question, but it was religiously based views about sexual orientation and gender identity. And one very interesting thing that we saw was among Gen Z respondents, that they were the most consistent generation in their support for professors being able to share religiously based views on controversial topics, and specifically on controversial topics around sexual orientation and gender identity. And so they were the most supportive on that second piece of professors being able to share religious-based views on sexual orientation and gender identity. So I encourage you, that's one of the many nuggets that are in the full report and only accessible through the full report that I would encourage you to go and see. Additionally, another free speech context and an area where there are conversations about what is appropriate or inappropriate is among workplace conversations about religion. So this is an area where we saw a little bit more tension than others. 38% of the samples said that they were comfortable discussing religious topics in the workplace. This was more than those that said they were uncomfortable, but still not a huge portion of respondents. So we thought maybe those who say that their faith is important to them would be more comfortable discussing these topics in the workplace. And that was true to some degree, but still not a majority. So then we looked at those who have coworkers of faith or religious coworkers, and we were very encouraged to see that 55% then said that they were comfortable sharing these or discussing religious topics in the workplace. So what we feel like we see there is that coworkers of faith seem to have a warming as opposed to chilling effect on the ability to be able to speak freely and have conversations when it is such a time where it seems impossible often to have these conversations. And we'll see that in the COVID context come up as well in just a moment with our last finding. So we're 2 years into the pandemic now, almost, and we've seen many restrictions come and go. We've seen different regimes set up by government to decide what is essential and what is not essential. So we asked respondents, what do you think should be considered essential activities in the context of a pandemic and be protected and be allowed to stay open? So we asked about a number of activities that take place at houses of worship and some that take place at other venues. And we were interested to see that only funerals at houses of worship and worship at houses of worship reached a majority of respondents saying that these should be considered essential activities. However, the other activities that take place at houses of worship, other religious ceremonies, community service, and weddings were more likely to be seen as essential than activities that took place at other venues. And a really interesting subgroup to explore here was among those of racial and ethnic minorities. So it seems that there is something a little bit different about Black and Hispanic respondents' experience with houses of worship in the pandemic, whereas the total sample, only a majority said funerals and houses of worship should be considered essential. Among Black and Hispanic respondents, other religious ceremonies were also considered essential by a majority, and so too was community service, both, again, at houses of worship. And not only did they differ in interesting ways from the total sample, but they also differed in interesting ways from the sample of white respondents, where on other religious ceremonies, we see 10, 12-point difference between Black and Hispanic respondents who we have equal portions saying they should be essential, and only 45% of white respondents. Again, too, in community service at houses of worship, a 9, 10-point difference there. And so this is especially noteworthy, I think, when we consider that Black and Hispanic respondents in so many ways have been hit hardest by the pandemic and have suffered the results of it in unique and difficult ways. So beyond houses of worship, also when we look at the very fast evolving realm of vaccine mandates, we see something interesting happening. We see that more respondents are okay with religious exemptions than those that are not. However, it's not quite a majority. These two questions that we asked here and that you're seeing on these slides are specifically when the government mandates vaccination for employers and employees. So one thing, though, that we looked into was those that, again, have religious coworkers or coworkers of faith. How do they view religious exemptions? And it was very fascinating to see that those that have coworkers of faith, religious coworkers, are much more likely to be okay with religious exemptions than the total sample. So it's a 12-point and 11-point difference. 12-point difference there, just general acceptance for religious exemptions, and 11-point difference when there are other exemptions that are allowed, such as medical or philosophical reasons. And I think this really kind of takes us back to this overall key finding that we have, and this broader finding of a rebound in support and a newfound confidence. Coworkers of faith here, and as we saw in other contexts, seem to have a warming as opposed to chilling effect. And I think that begs a lot of questions of exactly how has the pandemic and so much else that is going on in our country today changed the experience of religion, changed the way that people of religion and people of not of religion interact with each other. And I think that is something that we want to explore with you all in the coming weeks and the coming months. We don't necessarily have the answers for exactly why that is or what that means, but we want to know, and that's really what we want to use the index for, is to take it as a jumping off point for conversation about what's behind these results and what the implications are for policy, for the interactions of people in their daily lives in the future. So we look forward very much to hearing all of your ideas as we continue to look through these reasons and look through these results. And I think this is a great place to get that broader conversation started with our panel of experts. They each have very unique insights and experience with religion and religious liberty, and we are excited to hear from them. So with that, I want to invite our panelists to resume their video, and I will hand it over to Katie Geary for our panel discussion. Katie Geary is our content manager at Becket and the co-host of our podcast, Stream of Conscious. She will introduce our lovely panelists today, and I would also just remind you all to submit any questions you have for the panel or for myself or for Dee to media@becketlaw.org, and we will take the opportunity to answer those shortly after the panel discussion. So thank you all, and I will hand it over to Katie.
Thank you, Caleb, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. It's really exciting to share these results with you. And of course, and a special thank you to our panelists, who I'm going to go ahead and introduce right now. We've got Kelsey Dallas, who covers religion, politics, and the Supreme Court for the Deseret News and serves as deputy editor of Deseret News National. Thanks so much for being here, Kelsey. We've got Jonathan Silver, editor of Mosaic Magazine and host of the Tikva podcast. We've got Michael Ware, former director of faith outreach under President Obama, leading strategist and author, and Montse Alvarado, who, in addition to being Beckett's executive director, is host of EWTN News in Depth. So thank you for joining us today. All of our panelists are experts on that sometimes tricky intersection of faith and politics, and I know we're going to have a great discussion, so I want to jump right in. And I'd like to start with a question about the pandemic and how the majority of Americans view certain religious activities as essential, those funerals and worship at houses of worship, viewing them as essential by far more than non-religious activities. Michael, I'm wondering, what do you think that says about how Americans have responded to the struggles of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I think there have been some reasonable fears, concerns that the ways in which COVID might have motivated some to take temporary breaks from congregational life, that might cultivate new kinds of ways of looking at the role of faith, the centrality of faith, and even an estrangement from faith. But I think this data shows some really promising signs that actually it's possible that the main sort of outcome in this space from the last 2 years we've been through is a deepening of the sense of the importance of faith, of both through what people were missing out on, folks who weren't able to attend congregational worship and realize the gap that left in their lives, but also I think we've seen for the last 2 years, as we see in so many other crises and disasters, that it's religious groups that are stepping up to meet the need out there. That it's the person on the vestry or the deacon at the church who is keeping tabs on all the elderly folks in the congregation that may not have anyone looking out for them. It's the church that's able to host COVID safe, socially distanced, food banks outside the church so that folks can get food to eat. And so, I think this data, I think, will be really encouraging, should be encouraging to all Americans, and suggests that some of the dire predictions about the influence that COVID would have on religious life in America might not be quite right. The last thing I'll say is, I mentioned the practical. I mentioned sort of folks, feeling like being away from congregational life perhaps gave them a greater appreciation for it. I do want to go one level up and just note, obviously we don't have the data here to prove it, but I just raise here, I think there's an assumption in some quarters that when sort of natural interventions break into people's life, that it actually leads them to question the metaphysical, question the supernatural, question the role of their faith. And I'm not sure it plays out that way. And this data seems to suggest that maybe it's the inbreaking of these natural interventions that have led people to do some deeper soul searching and deeper thoughts about their life and the lives of their communities. And so that's an interesting facet of COVID and faith that I look forward to exploring in the weeks and months to come.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of interesting considering the strong feelings that Americans have about worship, funerals, houses of worship. Especially early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of restriction on worship. So I'm curious, Michael, just as a quick follow-up, do you think that might be contributing to any kind of anti-government attitude among Americans, or?
Yeah, so I want to put the focus on the restrictions themselves. I've been quite sort of clear in my view that I think the bigger problem has been a lack of direct attention of some public officials and respect for the role that faith plays, and that closing down or restricting access to a church or a mosque or a synagogue is not like restricting access to a hair salon or the local pub or whatever. Sometimes these directives that came out, well-meaning, that there was a lot on folks' plate, but to just sort of squeeze churches in a list of dozens of other kinds of establishments and houses of worship are part of tier whatever, that I think doesn't reflect the place that religion has in the lives of many Americans. It doesn't reflect, I think, how public officials and our laws treat religion as differently from some of these other things that require special attention. And I think that could be improved upon. There were some localities I think did a much better job. Mayors who weren't just handing out edicts, but were actually meeting with clergy and religious communities before the restrictions went out and sought community buy-in. There were others who I think it was more of a top-down approach, a sort of, this is what we have to do. And I would have liked to have seen a greater level of community engagement and asking religious communities to be partners, when many civic officials, I think, viewed religious communities as problems to solve. And that set up an antagonistic dynamic that I think has a part to play in some of what we've seen happen over the last couple of years.
Right. Thank you. I wonder if that, how religious communities see the importance of their house of worship in their lives kind of brings me to this next point about that difference between, white respondents and Black and Hispanic respondents on this question of what's essential. And Jonathan, real quick, I want to get your thoughts on that. That difference in Black and Hispanic respondents being much more likely to say that community service and other religious activities at houses of worship are essential. What do you think that does to the prevailing narrative we've got of religious liberty, who it's for, what it's about?
I mean, it's a great question. America is just such a very awfully complex society that's very heterogeneous. And it's simply a fact of our country that it's made up of these great subcommunities, many of which are characterized by their communal faith. And so we should expect that communities constituted in that way by their congregational membership would live more of their lives through the church. In many places that are constituted like that, the church plays essential community functions, coordinating medical care and food and childcare and Housing services, sometimes, as Michael was saying, it is an institution that mediates between the citizen and the government. Sometimes it's a direct service provider itself. And these, it seems to be, these are the essential facts of the women and men and children who live in those places. And so often what secular, upwardly mobile Americans who've never experienced that kind of communal infrastructure need to understand is that for many religious people, the provision of medical care is as much a function of their religious obligations as prayer. And the care of the widow and the orphan is undertaken voluntarily by churches and mosques and synagogues throughout the country. And that would only be surprising to you if you don't live in that sort of community. It seems to me that it would be natural to extrapolate that more Black and Hispanic respondents to your survey probably do. To me, it seems like this is another face of that phenomenon in our culture wars about language and history and gender and identity, that more progressive whites believe in the term Latinx than do Latinos. Like it's a related phenomenon, it seems to me. To a certain kind of upwardly mobile secular professional, houses of worship simply are not at the center of their communal life. And to them, these places offer discrete services for the inflection points of human life, like weddings and funerals. But one of our country's real challenges is that that type of person who sees religious service as a commodity for the inflection points of life rather than a daily and weekly cornerstone of the community, is that former view is overly represented in our media, and so it's presented as more normal than I suspect it really is. Were it not overrepresented that way, these results probably would not be that surprising.
I think you're right. And I would love Kelsey to weigh in here too on, what do you think the gap is between what ordinary Americans in all these communities see from churches and faith-based organizations and what the headlines say, and what's the gap there?
Well, I think I am remembering in looking at all of these data, how often the stories, even I myself write about religious freedom, focus on a conflict, on people butting heads, and especially the Republican and Democratic parties totally disagreeing about what types of policies should be in place for faith-based organizations or for churches in the case of closures. And what those headlines lose, the nuance that gets lost, is that not everybody, but a majority of Americans are actually on the same page on many of these issues with we should try to allow certain worship services to keep happening during a pandemic, or we should allow funding to go to religious organizations that are doing really wonderful social work. And so anytime I see this data, there's this sinking feeling in my gut that says, have we lost track of that shared goal in the midst of sort of battling about what's the best path to that goal? And so this is an important reminder to keep focused on the consensus, even in moments of tension.
I think that's a really good point. Clearly our data showed that there is a lot Americans have in common in their beliefs about religion and its place in public square. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk on that speech issue. We see more than 60% of Americans saying that religious viewpoints should be part of the public conversation on controversial topics. So I would love to get everyone's opinions on this, but, Monse, do you want to start? Like, what's your experience in, the difference between Twitterverse and how that plays out, and what you think is the ordinary American's understanding of the place of religious views?
That's interesting, Katie. It's fun to listen to Kelsey and Michael and John because they come from such a different perspective and with different life experiences and also different media experiences as authors and constantly looking at this issue. I think the narratives that you represent most of the time are that undercurrent of the real American experience that does understand that religion is essential, dare I use that word, and that it is a bipartisan, that it is about our human reality and our human experience. And so in terms of talking about these issues, a lot of the time people forget that the catalyst for civil rights, the catalyst for all of these issues are religious people who are seeing something very special about the heart of the people that they need to defend. And they forget politics and they forget all of the things that blind us and see only that there's something that needs to be pursued for fairness, for justice, right? And so it's beautiful to see that even in those conversations, people want religious leaders to take the lead, possibly because there's formation of forgiveness, of compassion that they know that they can lean into to have some of these really difficult discussions. And I know last year we saw that too, where there was a trend to desire race conversations to be something that is had within the context of religion. And you saw some people take that up, and that issue, particularly within white evangelical communities, start to pop up. So we're seeing the fruits of that now in public narratives. And I think that for a lot of racial minorities, that's a very comfortable place to have these discussions, because their religious homes are the reason they have a place in society. Their religious homes are the catalyst. If you look at Chicago, the catalyst for a new pastor who is running for Congress, right? They are the place where they organize their communities and then go out confidently into the public square.
You know, I wonder, being surrounded by religious people seems to have an impact on, you know, how people feel about having religion out there and spoken and really public. And, you know, Michael, I know you've done work on this with, you know Your Neighbor. And what do you think is the importance of those interactions with people around us?
Yeah, it's critical. And I think we need to, I think it's lived experiences, absolutely. I mean, just practically going to play a role here, but I think we need to offer up the opportunity and open up some space for the possibility of, which I think is reflected in this data, of folks with no religious experience still recognizing around them that it's meaningful for others, and that and for religious folks to take on, not from a place of defensiveness or a place of hesitancy or gosh, I wish I didn't have to be doing this, but actually take it up as part of their calling, as a great opportunity to actually help those who don't have such religious experience understand what it means to be religious. That to me is one of the principal challenges facing religious freedom in this country right now, which is that really through no fault of their own, we have a significant percentage of folks who just don't have any real understanding of what it means to be religious, what it means to have a religious conscience. And for me, that's a wonderful opportunity. What an incredible opportunity to introduce folks to that idea. And that's something that all of us need to take on.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly, though, we saw some similar support from people who consider themselves people of faith and those who didn't. So maybe, Jonathan, maybe you've got something to say about what you think this could say about how Americans just generally, their religious experience is changing. How do Americans view religion in their lives, and how much does it matter to them?
Katie, I think it's a great question. I really don't know. But it's a very interesting finding that support for the idea of religious freedom doesn't altogether depend on whether the respondent is himself or herself a religious person. I'd really like to think that it's because religious freedom, is a foundation of the American constitutional tradition, but I don't have any evidence to think that. I'd sure love if that were true. It might be a sort of instinctive kind of relativism, like, you religious people, you do you, just don't judge me when I do me. It might be that. It might be, as I think we've already said in this discussion, that over the last years of the pandemic, when the scale of suffering and death has been so pervasive in our country, that even people who are not themselves nourished by the consolations of faith can see that their neighbors are. And so it's very possible that has something to do with it too.
That's very interesting. Kelsey, do you have anything on your mind to add to that?
Well, I think the pandemic created an opportunity not just for faith groups or religiously affiliated organizations to offer help to their community through things like food banks or clothing drives, but also just to talk about their work in more visible ways, because of the fact that so many churches and other houses of worship were live streaming their services. More than ever before, my Facebook feed has been filled with live streams or with just videos of past events or flyers about upcoming events. And it just felt like churches before the pandemic didn't really build up those muscles. They didn't talk about their work quite as much. And so that could be one of the silver linings of the pandemic, is that houses of worship got much more used to interacting with the public on social media.
It's a very interesting point. I wonder, Monse, do you think that that might impact how faith-based organizations and houses of worship attempt to partner with the government, and how that might, the outcome of that might be if they do?
Absolutely. I think that this whole moment has really been a decision-making moment for people of faith and institutions, faith-based institutions, to consider, is the government a partner or is the government a villain? And I think that in the beginning of the pandemic, everyone was seeing the government as a villain because they were being restricted. People didn't really understand what was going on. The courts were hesitant to get involved. And then over Thanksgiving, there was this watershed moment with litigation where the courts said, no more, religion is essential, let's go for it, open up churches for people. And at that moment, the government needed all of these religious groups and religious institutions to get the word out. We were talking about earlier the experience of ethnic communities. They may not identify as religious, but they're going to church for information about ICE raids, for information about where their schools are going to be open or not, translation services for people who don't speak English. All of those community building realities happen in church, and people think of them as cultural or community. They don't think of them as religion. So there's a very interesting duality in the way that Americans and immigrant Americans perceive religion, which could be influencing this a little bit. Not necessarily if you look at the crosstabs, but I still think it's a cultural wave. And then from their perspective and the perspective of general Americans to see, okay, government was getting in my way, now government needs me, or government isn't actually going to be able to get into the peripheries where they can't reach, we can reach, the community can reach. And then the government recognizing that as well. So there's a forced moment of partnership happening here. And I think if we go on the Becket side of this, thinking about litigation, I think you're seeing that more and more with the Carson case following up on Trinity Lutheran and Espinoza, where funding going to people of faith, funding going to religious institutions as an issue where it's about equal access and not preference from the government. When you get to that point, I think that this pushed it and drove it home for a lot of Americans who were getting some kind of relief and some kind of help from a religious partner that, even though they weren't of their same faith persuasion, they weren't necessarily sharing in a confessional moment, but they were sharing in the benefits of having people of faith around them.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's sort of interesting. We asked respondents to talk about who they thought should protect religious liberty in the government, and it's used, government had been the villain. Now it's not a villain, it's a partner. But it's kind of interesting when we look at the different branches of government, right? So we saw Americans this year saying that first and foremost, the president is who they look to protect religious liberty, and then the courts, which is a little similar to last year. But I think the important point is that Congress trails behind. So, Kelsey, do you have a comment on that? Why do you think that it seems discordant somehow with the reality?
Well, it's not that it's a surprising result. I certainly understand where people's minds go with the fact that Congress takes many weeks, if not months, to pass even sort of basic essential bills, and they're not really taking up new projects when it comes to religious freedom protections these days. And so where we've seen movement, it's been in the courts or it's been through an executive order. But what I think is sort of sad or needs to be remembered when you look at those results is that the work of an executive order comes very quickly and then can disappear very quickly. That we have President Joe Biden come in who has a different approach to religious freedom than former President Donald Trump did. And so suddenly what many groups thought were gains during the Trump administration are now being taken away. And so you can't really count on the support of the executive branch, if that makes sense. It doesn't amount to the same sort of long-term substantial change that a new law passed by Congress does.
Monse, did you want to add anything to that?
I mean, it's also not as sticky, right? When you think about what the different branches of government can do, you're looking at long-term wins that are hard to overturn in the courts. And at the same time, you're looking at legislation and regulation. With regulation, of course, with turnover, you also turn over everything and start from zero. And with Congress and gridlock, I think people just don't have faith that that is really where things are going to happen anymore. And because they don't see their values reflected in what is being passed or what is being, how things are being championed, I think it's very frustrating and people have a tendency to turn things off, right? But also there is a generational split there. And I think the results of the index speak to that, in that new generations, people like Alejandro Ocasio-Cortez, a couple of other younger members of Congress, don't split themselves. They don't split their identity. They very confidently quote scripture. They talk about all of these issues, and they bring their faith with them. Whether people have issues with the interpretation of their faith that they bring with them, that's on them. But they're not splitting themselves into two people. The old guard definitely does. They're more hesitant to bring in scripture. They're more hesitant to lean on a moral authority to talk about these issues. And I think that is encouraging and off-putting to different Americans, but they are watching a shift in how faith is leveraged in legislation and in Congress, and it's an interesting trend to follow.
Yeah, if I could just jump in there, so I want to affirm everything that was just said, and I just want to add one other dynamic piece that has, I think, been alluded to, but we're at an interesting moment now where we've seen growing bipartisan openness, if not outright support, for a more active government, particularly in providing economic supports. But because that support is broadening, it's coming from sectors of society that have very different opinions about the levers and frankly the strings that come attached with that active government. And so it's a really interesting challenge for those of us who believe in an active government and a strong social safety net, et cetera. All of that project is in a critical moment right now where the support that has been gained for an active government can very much be undermined if an active government for economic supports is also trying to use those economic supports in ways that impinge upon religious freedom. And so it's a really important political decision that has to be made about exactly how much and what is going to be advanced even over the next 72 hours.
Right. Well, I want to jump on your point about how there's been some bipartisan, coming together on certain issues, and I want to take it a little bit more local. So Caleb talked about the question on public school education, and we thought it was just fascinating that, a majority of Americans think that parents have that final say on what their kids should learn. And Jonathan, I was wondering if you want to speak a little bit to how parents, raising up the next generation is so important, like how parents and schools should be working on that together.
I mean, that's just a really wonderful question, and I think a wonderful source of hope for our politics. Democracies, especially wealthy commercial democracies like ours, are prone to civic boredom and disengagement. And the fact that the question of how the next generation of Americans is going to be formed and taught, and how they will receive their first impressions of the American story, the fact that that question has brought parents to engage in the democratic process, it seems to me is a good thing. Parents are the ones most responsible for raising the next generation. And so they're necessarily forced to think about the country that they're handing over to their children. And I think our politics in general would be a lot healthier, a lot better, if Republicans and Democrats and independents are all competing over the question of how to serve the interests of parents.
Thank you. Overall, the index showed this bounce back. That's what we keep saying. This bounce back to formerly positive support for religious freedom. Kelsey, what have you seen that speaks to kind of a sense of optimism or recovery maybe among Americans in the last 6 months versus the last 18 months?
I think it's this idea that that Michael was speaking about earlier, where this time apart, both from your house of worship, or if you're not active in a house of worship, your just community, your neighbors, the people you love, have really taught you not to take that for granted anymore. and that sort of everyone is raring to go resume what might be considered normal life, dare I say it. And so as we sort of move forward, I hope that people keep that spirit of not taking anything for granted, and continue that deep reflection on what makes their life great, what makes this country great, and just recommit towards working to that, even when life becomes more chaotic and distracting again.
Monse, I would invite you to add your thoughts.
I think there's definitely a lot there. Kelsey makes a good point, and you see it in her reporting. There's a lot of hope. But this is, as much as the pandemic is this huge thing that we're all dealing with and will be dealing with for a long time, I think it's a trend where Americans for a long time have been trying to figure out this question about how much government and where, and how much religion and where. And the past 10 years, at least in the courts, have really shown that Americans really want to see opportunities for people of faith and institutions of faith to really engage and to solve some of the big questions that government hasn't been able to find solutions to, and kind of take the lead, as they usually do, to then hand off some of the solutions and allow there to be a roadmap that's followed or reinforced by government in some way. So I think that for a lot of people, I would say this is a continuation of providential one, if you want to get into issues of faith, where something happened in our world that forced us to continue down a path that we were, in my mind, already on.
Thank you. Well, I personally have really enjoyed this discussion, getting all of your great insight. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's benefited. So again, thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, Michael and Jonathan and Monse. And I think it's time for us to open this up to our question session.
Excellent. So thank you all, panelists. I was lucky to just be able to listen in on that conversation. Again, if you have any questions, please just submit them to media@becketlaw.org. And I also just want to remind everybody that the index, full materials, a full report, one pager, many other resources are available at becketlaw.org/index. If anybody is joining us late, the recording of this conversation and presentation will also be available there, hopefully today or within the next few days. So to get us started on the questions, someone asked, were there any surprises among different generations of respondents? So I'll go ahead and take that one, and Dee, if you have anything to add. I think there were many surprises. One thing that really stuck out across many questions was very high levels of support among Gen X respondents. I think we'll probably do a follow-up mini release of some data in the coming days about this, just because it seemed like in so many areas, Gen X was really stuck out for being supportive of religious freedom. And I don't know if you have anything to add there, Dee, but also on that question where that was really one of the main key findings, the key results about religious organizations being just as eligible to receive government funds as non-religious organizations. We've seen a steady increase among Gen Z respondents over the past couple of years. So that's something that younger generations have been warming up to, that I was very interested to see among those different generations. Dee, anything for among different generational respondents or ages that surprised you or that stuck out?
Well, just generally older generations are more supportive, and it wanes off as you get younger. But the exception you pointed out, I think, is kind of the thing that was surprising about that. Nothing else really beyond that.
Great. Okay, let's see. A question here for the panelists. What trends in religion and religious experience are you watching closely in the coming years? So anybody can feel free to answer that, but I'd be especially interested, Monse and Kelsey, trends in religion or religious experience, the way it's changing, that you are interested in watching or following closely.
I can jump in. I wanted to mention this earlier when we were talking about different responses on church activities as an essential activity, and the differences with Black respondents and I believe the Hispanic group as well. This is really important to this discussion about what is the future of the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party both has a very large block of non-religious, college-educated, mostly white young people, but then a very firm block of Black church members, and have those two groups have very different relationships with organized religion. And so in the years to come, the Democratic Party will really be wrestling with this issue of religious freedom. And those two parts of it in particular will be sort of fighting for what types of policies make the most sense for the party and the country.
I think that's a great point to bring in. Yeah, Monse, what were your thoughts there?
That was my third, so I'm glad we're on the same track. I see two other things. One we brought up already that I think Michael leaned into a little bit, which is role of government. Taking party lines aside, what is it that we need to do for our society to be supportive of religion? What does that look like? Is it more or less government, and answering those questions very thoughtfully? You're seeing a lot of different divisions and conversations among leaders, but also at the grassroots level, what people are asking for and lobbying for. So I'd put that in a corner of something to watch. And then the other thing that I'd be watching are divisions within religious communities. So we're watching the evangelical world struggle with certain things. We're watching Catholics struggle with different things and what that looks like. The Jewish community as well, dealing with the issue of anti-Semitism and what that means for Orthodox and Reform individuals. So I think there's a lot there in terms of just the issue of division and how people are dealing with that and then coming together beside it, and what that does mean for religious freedom.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's great. Those are great points. Michael or Jonathan, anything to add on those trends that you're interested in watching over the coming years?
I mean, Caleb, to me, the most interesting thing to attend to is the previous question, is something embedded in the previous question about Gen Z. The sort of secularization story that we tell ourselves is a kind of bedtime fable about how the young are attracted to liberation and reason, and to shed off all of the inheritance of the past. But what we're seeing is an unbelievably interesting resurgence among at least in the social conservative, corner of the country. That's a very young group of people, and they are tremendously energized in a way that is just really interesting. And I think attending to that and trying to understand what its causes are and what it could lead to is the thing to watch.
I completely agree. That reminds me of a result that we highlighted quite a bit last year about Gen Z respondents, that they were more likely than many other generations of respondents to say that their faith had been especially important during the COVID pandemic. I think that took a lot of people by surprise. And we asked that question this year, and they showed similar portions of Gen Z respondents saying faith is a really key part of what gets me through the pandemic, beyond just the faith being important. And so I think, Gen Z will challenge many of our expectations in the coming years about religion, religious experience, and religious liberty for sure. Michael or Dee, anything to add on those trends that you're watching?
Just a quick thing on Jonathan's, and that is that this idea of tolerance has almost come full circle. 10 years ago, tolerance was about being tolerant of non-faith-based. And it turned so much that now the younger generation is coming and saying, well, if we're tolerant, we should be more tolerant to faith-based people. And so it's come full circle a little bit, I think, is part of what's going on there.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point as well. A question, I think, for Dee and I, and also I think we can open this up to the panelists just more broadly, but how does the index fit into conversations about increasing non-affiliation and people attending church less? I think what we're seeing, I think that's actually a big part of what the index is trying to do, right? We've seen the rise of the nuns has actually plateaued, but as people's religious affiliation changes, as their religious experience changes, how does that then translate to changes in opinion and positions on religious liberty is a really big objective of the index and what we're trying to accomplish. I think it just goes to say, or it just goes to the point of how religion really does touch on people's lives in so many different aspects. It's not just what they do one day of the week, or it's not just what they do at a certain place, but it affects how they are at school, at work, and their interactions with friends and their interactions with online. And so we see all these really interesting changes taking place in our culture. How does that then trickle down to changes in support for religious liberty? That's really, I think, a key question that the index is trying to ask and that we're trying to figure out and be able to track year over year. So I don't know, Dee, if you have anything to add to that piece.
No, that was a very
Yeah.
interesting.
And for the panelists, I want to kind of open that up more broadly about trends in non-affiliation or decreases in church attendance, etc. How do you see that as impacting opinions on or perspectives of religious liberty in the coming years?
Yeah, sure. And I was going to mention this in regards to the last question too, which is, you look at Britain, for instance, and there you have an organized, coherent lobby for religiously unaffiliated folks. In the States, I have not seen that coalesce at this point. There are groups and individuals that claim to speak for religiously unaffiliated Americans, but I think their claim to that is pretty weak. It will be very interesting to see, though, I think, as the religiously unaffiliated portion of the population grows, if there's a professionalization, if there's a institutionalization that takes place. I would say I'm not convinced that it must or that it's inevitable that it does, for the reason that there are so many other ways for people to identify themselves than by the fact that they don't believe in or don't belong to a religion. There are our civic space, sort of our mediating institutions are so robust that people can actually gravitate towards and identify with, I think, other kinds of groups. But it'll be very interesting to see how that develops, and that'll affect all of these questions.
Yeah, certainly. Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, Caleb, it seems to me that one of the trends to watch in thinking about this question is that some Americans hear, when they hear the phrase religious freedom, I don't think that this is very often what's intended, but what they hear is license to discriminate. And the extent to which that is embraced and internalized as the covert meaning of religious freedom is something to watch, and trying to understand how non-religious and religious people come to champion this constitutional principle.
Thank you. That's excellent. Anything to add? Anybody else, Kelsey or Monse, on that?
Yeah, I was going to pick up on that license to discriminate piece, because I think Michael really hit the nail on the head earlier when he was talking about how if you have fewer Americans who are members of a house of worship, who attend regularly, even if those Americans are generally supportive of faith and sort of see themselves as spiritual or religious, if they're not sort of sitting, hearing religious lessons regularly, they don't understand conscience claims quite as well. So you lose them very quickly when you're saying, I don't feel comfortable providing this bathroom to this transgender person, or including birth control in my employee health plan. And so you may have them up until that moment, but then they get very confused about how religion fits into that discussion, and that's where license to discriminate can really take hold. And so that's where what Michael said earlier is very important, which is that people of faith need to explain what is going on, explain why their beliefs are leading them to those actions, and not assume the type of religious literacy that we have assumed in the past.
Let me jump in real quick. I definitely agree with that. Religious literacy is something that Pew charts all the time and is plummeting. And it's not just for Christians and Jews anymore. The idea of what does a Hindu actually believe? Because everything that a lot of their belief systems, Buddhists as well, have been, appropriated into popular culture in a way that actually misrepresents what they believe and who they are. And so it's interesting. I do completely agree with having to emphasize and over-explain, but I think that people who are not religious do understand that they're motivated by something in the choices that they make. More and more so with this idea of conscious capitalism and with the movement to restore the environment. You're seeing a lot of different things come in that are treated like religion. They're treated like a set of values that animates who you are in society. And so I don't think that that concept is as foreign, especially the idea of conscience. It's the idea of religion labeled as such that becomes foreign. And so getting into these discussions is really important, talking about them more and more, but not assuming that people don't understand religion as something that will motivate you. I thought it was really interesting, not to bring up the controversial thing, how the vaccine mandates were repudiated by people who are not religious and normally are not on the side of religious freedom, but just from the idea that you would be allowed to believe something different than what the government is dictating for you, and that you would be allowed to make a decision for yourself, to take your time, think about something, and weigh the difference, the consequences of what you're being asked to do and make a decision for yourself. So I found that quite remarkable in seeing what Doug Laycock and a couple of others were publishing in the New York Times. These are big outlets and individuals who pride themselves on not necessarily being on the side of religious conservatives.
Yeah, thank you, Monse. I think it seems a lot of what I'm hearing is there just needs to be more conversation happening, kind of like what we're doing today, which is so refreshing. Just one more question here, I think, as we're about out of time. But if the question is, if religious experience is changing so quickly in America or is changing so drastically, how can you be sure your results will be able to accurately track changes over time? I think that's a really interesting question. I would suggest that the way that it does it is in two ways. One, the index questions are really focused on principles. I think those principles stay consistent over time. And we worked very hard to really, draw on our 25 plus years of litigation experience to accurately portray what the full breadth of potential religious liberty conflicts are. And secondly, I would say that each year, what a real strength of the index is that it has those 21 questions that stay the same. We track changes. But as you've seen in this presentation, this discussion today, we also ask questions on dozens of other issues that are very timely and are contemporary issues. And we try to combine those in a way that creates some sort of cohesive narrative. And I think that, is just a great place for me to plug everybody going to our website to see this full report. Some questions, for example, that we asked this year that we weren't able to cover in the time that we had were about healthcare and the place of religious beliefs in healthcare, both from the patient, doctor, and healthcare organization standpoint. We asked questions about accommodations in the military, about accommodations in prison and execution chambers. So there's so much more there. I would encourage everybody to go again to becketlaw.org/index and reach out to us at media@becketlaw.org with any questions. And one more time, just thank you so much to all our panelists and to Dee for coming with us today and being able to share your thoughts and your insights. It has been an extremely enriching conversation. We hope to continue these conversations with all of you in the coming days. And just want to say thank you and enjoy reading the index.